Have you heard of the art historical style Neoclassicism? Neoclassicism was an art historical movement that developed in late 18th century France, in part as a reaction against the playful, sometimes considered somewhat frivolous Rococo style. So, how are these two styles different? Let's get into it. I'm Dr. Megan Lorraine Debin, and I'm an art historian, and this is Art Trippin Lecture Series. Hi, I'm Dr. Megan Lorraine Debin, and this is Art Trippin. So here we are looking at The Oath of the Horatii by Jacques-Louis David. This is an oil painting from 1785. This is kind of the prime example of neoclassical painting. This is a history painting. And this kind of painting was really popular in late 18th century France, as it was the preferred kind of painting that was popular at the French Academy. So if you haven't checked out the video on the French Academy, check out that video. So history painting is kind of at the top of the hierarchy in the French Academy. And what we see here is a depiction of a scene from Roman history, or better, perhaps an imagined scene from Roman history. So the story is there's a battle in ancient Rome between Rome and Alba. This is recounted in Livy's History of Rome. And Rome and Alba are at war, and there are these two armies fighting. Usually the Romans were fighting over borders. And at a certain point, Rome and Alba decide to kind of use these proxies. They have these two sets of triplets. So one set is from Rome, the Horatii brothers or the Horatius brothers, and they're going to fight the three brothers from Alba, the Horatius. And basically, these brothers will be the representatives of their respective countries, and they're going to fight to the death. And this will determine the outcome of the war. The interesting thing is that these neighboring countries were really intertwined. So one of the Horatii sisters was engaged to one of the Horatii brothers. And the wife of one of the Horatii brothers was the sister of the Horatii. So all of these people are really intertwined. And this is a scene depicted by the French painter Jacques-Louis David in the moment that these three brothers, the Horatii brothers, are pledging an oath to win or die for Rome. And they are reaching their arms up, saluting these swords that their father is holding. And of course, the father, pater, that's Latin, is the symbol of Rome or the homeland or the country. And these three men are, pledging this oath, to win or die for Rome. And they're sort of oblivious to this emotional anguish of these women that are behind the father. So presumably these are, one is a sister and one is a wife, and they are kind of slumped over in despair. There appears to be a child with another woman kind of in the shadows. And these women are sort of in anguish because of the thought that either their brother or their husband will be killed in this battle. So how's this painting typical of neoclassicism? Now, remember Rococo art. If you haven't watched our video on Rococo art, go check that out. As you see from that other video, you know that Rococo is a style associated with the French aristocracy, and it's kind of considered a playful, sometimes even frivolous style with themes that focus on romantic love and sexuality. We see people outdoors in the countryside kind of enjoying life, drinking champagne, and frolicking in the garden. Now, when we look at the Oath of Horatii, we see a totally different style. First of all, we will see that these figures are no longer outdoors. They are indoors, an indoor scene, and they are characters from ancient Roman history. So we have subject matter that is deemed more appropriate for history painting by the French Academy. And we see this narrative of patriotism and sacrifice over all else. So these brothers are pledging this oath to their father and also to Rome. So this is very patriotic. And they are willing to sacrifice their lives and their familial relationships. Their marriages, their siblings will all be put at risk of at least emotional pain through this task. We see a somewhat shallow space that might recall Baroque painting with some simple classical architecture framing these figures. We see these three rounded archways, which is typical of classical architecture. This is something that you will also see in Renaissance painting, and you'll see it here again in Neoclassical painting. You will also see that the overall color palette is different from Rococo painting. In lots of Rococo painting, because the figures are often outdoors, in gardens, or on islands, surrounded by greenery, trees, and flowers. In contrast, we're indoors and we have a very warm color palette. Earthy tones with some pops of red, and we have some really strong chiaroscuro or tenebrism. So in some ways, this style perhaps recalls the Baroque style. I'm thinking of Caravaggio with his muddy, earthy color palette and his pops of red. We can see the figures are modeled very carefully. They're very statuesque. We've got these kind of rigid, angular forms of the men. They're standing in these really strong poses with their arms raised and their legs out and kind of like forming a cross. And they really contrast with the soft, curvilinear shapes of these women who have slumped over. We see this focus on hard edges and sharp lines. Overall, this whole painting is rendered very tightly, very smoothly. There's almost no evidence of the painter's hand. You cannot see visible brushstrokes. These are very flat and smooth on the surface level. When we're looking at these really strong characters, you'll also see this light kind of shining onto the arms of these brothers and the swords. And this is really creating a focal point on the oath itself. And so we have this juxtaposition of the courage and the valor and the patriotism and the loyalty of these three brothers who are swearing this oath to protect Rome. And this is kind of contrasted against the ideals of love. And these are the ideals that the French aristocracy really hold dear in the late 18th century. Now, we have to think about this painting in its historical context. We are on the verge of the French Revolution. There is a looming financial crisis in France at the time. The people are literally starving in the streets, and the French aristocracy is out drinking champagne in the garden, totally oblivious to the pain and suffering of the working classes and of the poor of France. So on the verge of revolution. And the Rococo style is really seen as an example of the decadence of the French aristocracy. I think of this as like, in our contemporary context, how out of touch the 1% is with the regular working class individual. The French Rococo style is really associated with the aristocracy, and it becomes emblematic of how out of touch the French aristocracy is with the plight of the working class and of regular everyday French citizens. In contrast, this new neoclassical style that we see in Jacques-Louis David's Oath of the Horatii becomes symbolic of the revolutionary ideals. David almost becomes for a moment here the voice of the revolution. The idea is that this is how you need to be. If you want to defeat the aristocracy, which the working class people, the regular everyday people of France begin circulating pamphlets. This is how they're spreading the idea of the revolution. And they eventually bring out the guillotine and kill the aristocracy. If you're going to take down this aristocracy, you have to be like the Horatii brothers, willing to put it all on the line, willing to sacrifice your own life and your own family or love relationships for your ideals, for patriotism, for the country itself. So David's Oath of the Horatii really embodies revolutionary ideals in late 18th century France. If we look to another Jacques-Louis David, The Death of Socrates from 1787, we will see a similar narrative. So what's the iconography here? You may have heard of the ancient Greek philosopher Socrates. He is accused of the crime. The crime is, which I hope someday I can be accused of, corrupting the youth. He denies this, of course. He says, I'm not corrupting them, I'm just teaching them. Socrates, the great teacher, but he is condemned to death. He could spare his life, so he's not going to give the death penalty if he admits to his crime. But he says he will not admit to something that is not true. He prefers to remain true to himself, true to his ideals, and die rather than admit a falsehood. So here we see in David's painting this scene of Socrates on his deathbed, really, in prison, and he is being handed by this gentleman in the kind of burgundy tunic. This man is one of his followers, and he's passing him the hemlock. The hemlock is the poison that he must drink. So even though Socrates' followers are begging him, his students are begging him to lie, just say that you did it, admit to this crime that the state wants you to admit to, Socrates refuses, and he drinks the hemlock as he is sentenced to death. So he does not give up on his ideals, and he sacrifices his own life. And here in David's painting, Socrates is even on his deathbed in the act of teaching. You see his arm lifted and his finger lifted. This is a pose of speaking or for orators in the ancient world. He is teaching his followers on his deathbed. They are begging him. Some of them are weeping. They have their faces in their hands. They're wailing. Some figures in the background are praying, asking the gods to spare Socrates' life. Despite all of this emotional outburst around Socrates, he remains steadfast in his truth that he would rather die than admit to a falsehood. So even on his deathbed, he's using this as a teaching moment. So you can see, again, think about how this ancient story from ancient Greece is playing out in 18th century France. We are again on the verge of revolution. The idea is that you will need the fortitude of Socrates. You will need this kind of belief in your ideals if you want to succeed through the revolution. So how is this painting typical of neoclassical art? Again, we see a kind of overall warm color palette with earthy tones, really smoothly rendered painting. We see a clarity. The costumes are plain, the gestures are simple, it's accurate, and we don't have any overly bright or pastel colors. We see the emphasis on Socrates through the lighting. Here he is in the moment about to take the poison in the act of teaching, and we have this soft diffuse light shining on him almost like a spotlight. And he is in this moment of heroism as he is accepting his fate rather than admitting to something that is not true. This is very typical of neoclassical art, this focus on duty, not the frivolous lifestyle of the aristocracy. Artists like David and others who are associated with the neoclassical style, they're trying to say, we are not like them. We are not like the aristocracy. We are not interested in drinking champagne in the bushes and having amorous affairs on an island. We are interested in the here and now, and we want to make life better for the people around us. And so we see a really laser focus on duty, civic duty. And in fact, this painter, David, became increasingly critical of the French aristocracy, and eventually he himself aligns with the French Revolution. Now, remember that the French had this legitimate criticism of the monarchy, and they took some lessons from the American War for Independence. Some of those lessons include the idea that it is right to take up arms against tyranny. There should be no taxation without representation. This is a very famous refrain in U.S. American history. They also believe all men, and they really only mean white men, all men should have certain liberal freedoms, and that a republic is superior to a monarchy. And so French thinkers began to push these ideas through pamphlets that were circulated around France, and this was highly successful at the time, as literacy was actually surprisingly high among all classes, obviously less so among amongst the working classes, but definitely amongst the bourgeoisie. And so the idea is that a lot of people had access to this information, perhaps in a way that, say, the internet creates access to information all over the world. So David was a fierce supporter of the French Revolution, and he was there as part of the revolution, almost akin to contemporary photojournalism. Here we see a drawing of his of Marie Antoinette stripped of her finery and awaiting execution. So what helped spark the French Revolution and the ideals that we see exemplified in neoclassical art? So this is an art style that develops in the last third of the 18th century in France, and it's very much influenced by Enlightenment ideals, as well as the recent discovery of the ruins of Pompeii and Herculaneum in Italy. So these artists drew inspiration from classical art and culture, that is, Greece and Rome. The style really prized heroic values, ideas of beauty, perfection, and proportion that are really a movement away from the excesses of the Baroque and Rococo styles. So in many ways, like Renaissance art, this is a return to classical Greek and Roman ideals. There is an interest in heroic patriotism and emotional restraint over the frivolity and romance of the Rococo. So, what helps fuel this renewed interest in the 18th century? Here we're looking at a 19th century photograph of the excavations of Pompeii. And excavations of the ruins at Pompeii and Herculaneum begin in 1748. And as they're digging this ancient Roman city out from under the volcanic ash, they are bringing out all of these examples of classical Roman art. And this is spreading around Europe and really helping to revive the popularity of classical culture. So we see the rediscovery of the ruins at Pompeii and Herculaneum, these two classical Roman towns that are outside of modern day Napoli today. These towns were buried under the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE, as you may or may not know. And in the mid 18th century, we see the beginnings of archaeology as a discipline and the beginnings of the excavations at Pompeii. Now, these archaeological discoveries at the time in turn started to fuel tourism to Italy. And we have the invention of the Grand Tour. This is something that we see with young aristocrats, Brits, but all Europeans engaging in a kind of grand tour in which young aristocrats would take their sons on tour through the art and history of Italy. So it's kind of like a rite of passage for the elite. I think one way to think about it in modern terms is almost like this is a 18th century example of kind of like doing study abroad. So it's not simply leisure travel, but education. It's almost a cultural pilgrimage. So visitors would travel from the UK or other parts of Europe, come across the Alps and travel through Italy, going to the major cities, studying the art and architecture, and of course ending up in Rome and at Pompeii itself. As they're visiting these sites, many visitors are purchasing antiquities. So they're buying art objects and bringing them home with them to England, for example. And these grand tourists are often paying for portraits of themselves in Italy. You can kind of think of this like, taking a selfie in front of the Colosseum, but instead it's, a portrait by Pompeo Battoni. And this was actually really interesting because it fueled a whole new market of portraiture for artists in Italy. We also see these grand tourists bringing home sort of postcard paintings. So the perfect example of this is Canaletto. This is a Venetian artist who's known for his vedute, or views or vistas, of this classic city on the water in northern Italy. Here we see an example of a grand tour portrait. We have this British duke with his doctor, his friend and doctor, and the latter's son. And you can see they're kind of standing around in an office or a study, and you can see behind them out the window this view of Geneva in the distance where they stayed for 2 years. So these grand tours would be several years long of study. Here we're seeing another grand tourist. This is Francis Bassett, depicted here by the Italian painter Pompeo Battoni in 1778. And actually, this was a great market for artists like Battoni. There was a whole new market for painters in Italy. They had all of these tourists coming to visit Italy, and so they had a lot of work. Here you see Francis Bassett sort of becoming familiar with the classical antiquities, and he's kind of standing against this vaguely classical pillar, and there's sort of bits of antiquities strewn about on the ground, and then different iconic Roman buildings behind him. So this is almost like a prototype for a postcard or a selfie. Canaletto was an Italian artist who provided grand tourists with images of Venice in particular, and he sometimes did portraits. So he really catered to this newly revived taste for antiquity. So these archaeological discoveries of Herculaneum and Pompeii and the grand tours to Italy really attracted the interest of the landed gentry and the aristocracy, resulting in a really growing fascination with antiquities, which were regarded as representative of an older and more noble civilization. So in addition to these kind of postcards or vedute and the grand tourist portraits, we also see a new market for antiquities, and wherever there are antiquities, there will also be forgeries. In Rome and England, these international communities of artists and art dealers were coming together to satisfy the desire of these wealthy patrons for classical objects. We would also see the production of modern replicas or copies as well as objects. And in fact, you have a whole new invention of the authentication of forgeries. So this is a viable business for people who are knowledgeable about antiquities. So for scholars, people who studied ancient art now had a new profession, which is verifying whether something was authentic or a forgery. So there's a whole new market for artists, for art historians, for scholars, for antiquities experts. And so this grand tour and this tourism helped fuel these artistic and creative industries around Europe in the late 18th century. And along with this new revolution in politics, we have neoclassical art all along the way supporting these new ideals of patriotism, civic duty, and virtue above emotionalism. And so in the 18th century, we see paintings function really in line with Enlightenment values. The idea is that art now has a moral function outside of its previous religious function. Art could be deemed as good and useful to the formation of civilized society if it inspired sensations which ultimately pleased and civilized the spirit. So the idea is that good painting stems from the mind, from logic, rather than from nature. So things like still life portraits, landscapes, and even portraiture are thought of as of lesser importance than history painting. And what kind of subject matter would be appropriate for history painting? Obviously, we're going to see some biblical scenes, but we will also see scenes from classical mythology and ancient history. And we will start to see depictions of contemporary significant events. These were also considered acceptable subject matter. And history paintings were meant to sort of inspire people and to civilize people. And as we see in the case of Jacques-Louis David, these paintings really become part of a mounting critique of the government and the French aristocracy. In David's style, we see an attention to detail, we see clean edge painting, crispness and tightness of rendering. We see a dramatic, heroic iconography and compositions. We see him focusing on great men of history like Socrates and later Napoleon. We see realistic but muted and earthy color palettes. This is really, again, in contrast to the pastel of the Rococo. David saw the art of antiquity as surpassing anything done in his own age, so he chose subjects from the idealized heroic Roman past, and he had this disdain for the gilded walls and the lace and the wigs of the Baroque and Rococo era. All of that was pretense. David felt that it was important for people to focus on the reality of the contemporary political climate in France. Now, although we think of neoclassical painting as a kind of French style, there are examples of neoclassical art throughout Europe. You'll see it in Italy and Germany. You will also see a neoclassical style in sculpture. For example, Antonio Canova's Psyche Revived by Cupid's Kiss from 1787 reveals this kind of return of classical subject matter and this crisp naturalism, but with some of the drama of the diagonal lines that Baroque art brings us. And of course, we will see neoclassical architecture throughout France at this time as well. We will also see that neoclassicism as a style spreads throughout Europe and even to the United States. So if you look at some of the buildings in our nation's capital, you will see this neoclassical style of architecture. Look no further than the White House or the Capitol building, and you can see those associations with classical culture, with ancient Greece and Rome, are meant to inspire virtue as civic duty and to evoke ideas of democracy. So hopefully, now that you understand some of these Enlightenment ideals, these discoveries of these ancient Roman cities, combined with this new tourism called the Grand Tour, hopefully you can see how all of that works together with also rising social tension and economic disaster. All of this works together to fuel the French Revolution.